Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to The Rebel Without Applause, coming to you from this, my nutshell of infinite space. By that, I mean my television studio apartment right here in the Wood of the Holly in the creative cradle known as Crotona, under the sign overlooking the COVID-addled but still somehow enchanted land of law. And I've got a very special guest with me today. This gentleman is a historian, he's a professor, and he's made a deep dive into the cultural and music history of Los Angeles. And he wrote a brilliant book, compilation of interviews and his own commentary. And it's called Central Avenue Sounds, the author of which is Steve Isoardi. And before I say hello, I want to thank you for your great work, because it was fundamental to my understanding of Central Avenue, which yielded a screenplay that I wrote called Central Avenue. So thank you and welcome. How are you?
Fine, Bill, and thanks very much for having me on, and thanks also for the kind words. Much appreciated.
Well, much deserved. A lot of people right off the hand, well, what the hell is Central Avenue? Well, what is it? I know, like, what's Central Avenue?
Bill, that got me started. In the 80s, I was saying, well, what the hell happened on Central Avenue?
And now I would say this: if you don't know about Central Avenue, you don't know about L.A. So tell me just how you stumbled on this archaeological dig called Central Avenue and how it seemingly has shaped your life.
Life hasn't been the same after I discovered Central Avenue and what it was about and decided to do something about recording its history. And that all goes back to two things that happened around 1987, 88. After finishing graduate work at UCLA, I'd always wanted to play music. And being obsessive when I was involved in graduate school, there was no time for anything. But when I finished the dissertation, I decided to start studying saxophone. And I found the teacher that everybody said to go to, a man named Bill Green. And he agreed to take me on as a student. And so I started working with Bill. And sometime into that, a friend of mine asked me if I would, since she knew I knew something of jazz, if I would write a review of a new documentary film called Ernie Andrews' Blues for Central Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
I said, yeah, sure. So I knew nothing about Central Avenue. And so I watched this film, and I got very curious. And I went to Bill, my saxophone teacher, and I said, Bill, do you know anything about Central Avenue? Bill just smiled and laughed, and he told me the story when he came out here in the mid-1940s from Kansas City. He was part of the Central Avenue scene, and he filled me in on that history, which stunned me, blew me away, and the film did as well. And I remember taking a ride then down Central Avenue. And that, in the mid-late 80s, there was nothing there. Half the blocks there were just rubble-filled lots with chain-link fences.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing to me that anything of any consequence ever happened there. But the more I started diving into it and getting a sense of this history, I was just blown away by the number of people. I was also blown away by the fact that there was no information anywhere, unless you went through the old black press, on Central Avenue. Right. Certainly nothing in the jazz books or anything else.
Right.
So Bill encouraged me. He said, why don't you do something about this? So I realized, given the lack of resources anywhere, the only way to get at this history was through oral history, interviewing musicians who had been part of the scene like Bill. So that launched the Central Avenue Sounds Project. I interviewed 37 Central Avenue musicians and a couple of producers, things like that. And that launched me into this work, which, documenting music history of the Black community, continues in my life to this day. It's been extraordinary for me. And I guess it's an indication that there are times in life when doors open before you and you just have to decide whether to walk through or not. This was something that had nothing to do with my academic background, but I have my passions, and politics and music are two of my passions. So that open door was there, and I just decided to walk through it.
For those that don't know, Central Avenue is a street. It's just east of Alameda, and it runs in a northerly and southerly direction. And by the time you get south of the 10 freeway, that's really the sort of ground zero of where this incredible cultural following of nightclubs and after-hours clubs and chicken shacks and after-hours clubs and jam sessions. It just was it must have been so thrilling to hang out there at that time. And I think you can correct me, but the times we're talking about, at least where to me that was its most vibrant, was from the years after World War II into the early 50s.
I think I'd give it a bit of a broader reach than just the post-World War II period.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Central Avenue lies west of Alameda.
Just west, right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
right.
West of Alameda. And the early development of the Black community starts downtown. And by the time of World War I, it has evolved through 4th, 5th Street down to about 12th Street, moving into the 20s during the 1920s. So the community is gradually moving south along Central Avenue as it grows. But the jazz scene is so alive, and there is so much going on here during those years, even during the 19s. I mean, the first important band, the original Creole band that travels the country on the vaudeville circuit from 1914 to 1918, playing New Orleans jazz, this new music. And these are musicians from New Orleans, but most of them were living in L.A. then. And they were discovered in downtown L.A. by the Pantages people. And they're the ones who put them on the vaudeville circuit. But that band was put together in L.A. by New Orleans musicians who were transplants. And in 1917, Jelly Roll Morton moves to L.A. Kid Ory comes in 1919. I mean, you've got some of the leading New Orleans musicians out here. The first recorded instrumental by a New Orleans jazz band doesn't happen in New Orleans. It's Kid Ory's band who record at a studio, the North Sky Recording Studio on Main Street in Santa Monica, May 1922. So there is this rich early history of jazz in Los Angeles and in the Black community that goes back that far. And as the community evolves and grows and moves down Central Avenue till by the late 30s, early 40s, it hits Slauson, which becomes the dividing line. White resistance draws a line in the sand there. Mm-hmm. And the community is not allowed to move past Slauson.
So Slauson is in an east-west direction, and this impedes a southerly expansion.
So that area from downtown to Slauson along Central Avenue is known as the East Side. And that really is the heart of the Black community in L.A. during this, period up to the early 1950s. Mm-hmm. And most of the Black community has to live there. If you jump then over 40 blocks of white housing from Slauson down to 92nd Street, you come to Watts. And that becomes a much more mixed community, and there is a substantial Black component of the Watts community as well, and many great Black musicians come out of there as well. But those are sort of the two main areas. The East Side is the premier area. It is Los Angeles' Harlem during this period.
Now, would that area include Jefferson High School, where so many kids?
Yes.
So that's sort of a ground zero of training for a lot of these musicians, many of whom are legends, remembered as legends today, but they got their start at Jefferson High School. Talk about that a little bit. I always find that fascinating, how so many geniuses came from one little spot.
Well, a number of them came from Watts as well in Jordan High School, but in the main East Side community, Jordan High School was the place that everybody went to school. But it wasn't until 1936 that an African-American faculty member was hired, and that was Samuel Brown, who's hired to teach music. Samuel Brown is a graduate of USC. He is trained in music from an early age. He's very competent. He has good relationships with composers like William Grant Still, et cetera. He's a very talented, intelligent musician and teacher. And he does an interesting thing when he gets to Jeff, because he finds out that all the kids are interested in jazz, in swing. And he creates a big band class, 6th period of Jeff, Bungalow 11.
Good job.
Yeah. He says, his background was in European classics, but he found that jazz was what grabbed all the kids. So he just put his arms around it, he said, and brought it into the high school. And he had this big band class where he encouraged students to study theory, to arrange music, to write music. And, this was just ground zero for so many wonderful musicians who went on to have great careers. And in turn, he would bring the leading performers into the school. Given the segregation, Black artists pretty much had to be along Central Avenue whenever they visited.
Right.
So Duke Ellington, when he was in town, was always around. Lionel Hampton, Nat Cole, all these people were accessible, not only to young people, not only on the avenue, but Sam Brown would bring them into the classroom and into Jefferson High School to perform. So this is, a tremendous amount of exposure to the music and to its leading figures who, usually made themselves accessible to young people.
I'm never totally sure why this piece of our history has been completely overlooked. A whole generation of geniuses really came out of that little speck of Los Angeles. And amongst those students, I'm just going to throw out, I made a list, and I'm not sure how many actually went to Jefferson, but I think Dexter Gordon did.
Yep.
Art Farmer.
Art and his brother Addison, they both were there.
Charles Mingus.
No, Mingus went to Jordan and Watts.
Okay, so but it's there. I mean, it's like next door. I mean, they would hang out with the same people. It's not that far away. Yeah,
they play in the same bands together sometimes.
Yeah, another figure. He's from San Pedro, but I also thought he figured prominently in this in his own way was Art Pepper. I read his book Straight Time, and I'm a big fan of his playing, but that book, Straight Time, is one of the greatest biographies I ever read, music notwithstanding. I mean, it really paints an interesting portrait of our city as well.
Yeah, Art Pepper, he's one of my favorite players. I think he was just a genius improviser. And, it's perhaps not surprising that he was born in Watts, and the family lived there for a few years before they moved west. And when he was 18 years old, he was playing. He would hang out on Central Avenue. He and Dexter Gordon then, in the late 30s, early 40s, were friends. And Art was always hanging out on Central. And then when he was 18, he was playing in Lee Young's big band at the Club Alabama,
mm-hmm.
The fanciest club on the avenue.
Right.
So he really, it's funny to me when he's referred to as part of the West Coast cool movement, because to me, that's just ridiculous. His roots are Central Avenue. And the fire I hear in his playing is Central Avenue.
Yes. And I just want to, for people that are listening, Club Alabama was one of probably the hottest venue on a nightclub basis, and it was next door to the Hotel Dunbar, the structure of which still exists. I had an opportunity to go in there and walk around some years back. I don't know what it is today exactly, but I think the building still exists.
Oh, yeah, the building is there. It's actually a historical landmark, and it provides housing. It was reconfigured a number of years ago, and it provides low-income housing now.
Right. There was a few photographs on the wall in the lobby that and there was, I think, some important nightclubs in there. You can help me.
Yeah.
Jack Johnson, I believe, that the famous heavyweight, had a venue or a club or a bar in there at some point. I remember reading. I don't know if that's true or not, but maybe I don't know.
No, he was a real presence on the avenue. He actually owned and operated a couple of places on Central. There's also a nice restaurant there now that you can go to anytime that's operating on the first floor. And usually every summer when they hold the Central Avenue Jazz Festival there, they open up the lobby area, the
mm-hmm.
first floor of the Dunbar, for people to go in and walk around and, breathe the air of, Billie Holiday and Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and all these great people who stayed at the Dunbar. It provided the finest accommodation for African Americans in the country. There wasn't a hotel in Harlem that was as nice as the Dunbar Hotel in L.A.
Mm-hmm. And I believe it was black owned as well. I think it's a dentist or I forget.
Well, it was built by Dr. Somerville and his wife Veda, and in 1928 it opened, and it hosted the NAACP convention that year. And he and his wife were both African American dentists who graduated from USC, and he was upset that African Americans coming to LA had no appropriate accommodation. So he built the what was called initially the Somerville Hotel. And when they opened that summer in July, the NAACP convention was held here, and its delegates were put up at the Somerville Hotel, who included W.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, and other leaders of the movement then.
So this would have been the national convention of the NAACP.
Yes, the national convention of the NAACP, and Du Bois always wrote, very nice things about the situation for African Americans in Los Angeles.
And that's interesting because as I mentioned to you, I just spoke to Mike Davis, who wrote The City of Courts, and his vision of Los Angeles was a much crueler canvas in terms of the racism and the exclusion and the brutality and the police.
Oh, it was that. There's no question. That was the case. L.A. was a southern town. And the racism, I mean, we're talking about how the community flourished in kind of a hothouse setting, within the context of a viciously segregationist society.
Mm-hmm.
And the Klan was active. At one point in the 1920s, the leader of the Klan was the chief of police. It was bad. And the musicians used to refer to outlying areas like Glendale and Southgate as Little Mississippi.
Exactly, yes. Or sundown towns, right? Yeah,
Oh, it was bad. Some have told me there was a club in Glendale that they were invited to go perform at by the guy who owned it, who used to be Al Capone's piano player in New York. And he liked the musicians, so he invited them up for these jam sessions. Well, as soon as they crossed into the city limits, they would be tailed by the police right to the club.
Okay.
The police made sure they only went to the club, and afterwards they were tailed until they were out of the city limits. I mean, it was this bad.
Yeah.
And then, not to mention, just the viciousness of the cops in general, which became more pronounced after World War II, when the LAPD really took on the Southern accent.
Right.
Because during the war, so not only African Americans came to LA in search of jobs in wartime factories, but also a lot of Southern whites with a lot of racist attitude. And that was, very prominent in Los Angeles. It was bad.
Right. And Chief Parker, I read, would recruit officers out of the southern states to patrol the black neighborhood.
Oh, yeah, deliberately.
L.A. buries its history as efficiently as those woolly mammoths are buried in the La Brea tar pits. There's just...
Oh, no question. When I first came down here in 1973, it seemed the most transient place I'd ever visited. Nothing was built to last. There was no sense of history, no interest in it. Nobody cared about it.
Mm-hmm.
In Central Avenue Sound, one of the most poignant moments was when I interviewed the great trumpeter Art Farmer. And Art was in town playing at Catalina's that week. Before we did the interview, he rented a car and drove back to Central Avenue because he'd been away from L.A. since the early 50s. And he wanted to refresh his memory. So he wanted to drive back down there, go to Jeff, et cetera. Well, when I saw him, he'd just come back. And he was shaken. And the way we end that chapter in Central Avenue Sounds captures that. And he says he was just so stunned because he said as he drove on there, he could not find anything that would attest to the existence of a place that shaped him, that meant so much to him, that inspired him so much. He said not one brick, that recalled any of that. And it almost made him think, was it all an illusion? It was really moving. He was a bit shaken by the experience.
As I understand it, he's not alone. Art Farmer, Dexter Gordon, Charles Mingus, I think Eric Dolphy would all qualify as people that really had to go abroad or elsewhere to get their chance, their shot. It feels like a recurring theme to me.
Oh, it is. And one of the, the few who stayed of that caliber from that Central Avenue generation was Buddy Collette, and then for the next generation, Horace Tapscott. They, are a couple of the few who would have had careers like that had they left and gone to New York, perhaps, but decided to stay, and they had a tremendous impact in their community.
I did have an opportunity to meet Buddy Collette. He was such a gentleman and such a sweet guy, and such a troubadour of the music. And one of the things that he was a very inspirational figure in terms of writing the script that I wrote, Central Avenue, because one of the things that he did was he was the first to integrate, I guess, some of the music, not the unions per se, but to get a top-flight studio arrangement job. And it was, I think it was Groucho Marx's show, as I recall, that he got that gig. So he was a big, he broke some barriers, that guy.
Well, in his autobiography, I titled one of the chapters, The Jackie Robinson of the Networks, because Buddy was the first to break into the TV network's regular bands when he was hired to the Groucho show. I don't think he did any arranging for Groucho, but somebody who did that earlier and who was the first to do that was drummer Lee Young, Lester Young's younger brother.
Okay.
And he was doing that in the early 40s. So there definitely, from that generation along Central, there were, definite path breakers.
And he was also part of the amalgamation of the two unions, the Black Musicians Union and the white. These musicians in the outreach between the Black Union and the White Union and the amalgamation, meaning they combine themselves, these folks were doing this way before the courts mandated it.
Most definitely. I mean, even the generation before, especially the guys who fought in World War I and came back, and saw something different and had experience fighting, they were much more staunch, much more ready to stand up and fight segregation. And certainly after World War II, that generation is as well. And in LA, in the segregated musicians unions, the white local 47 and the black local on Central Avenue 767 were the manifestations of that here. And it was the musicians in 767 who in 1949 started fighting within the musicians union to knock down segregated locals. And they waged that battle from 49 to 53. On April 1, 1953, the two union locals of the American Federation of Musicians in LA were amalgamated. So they eventually, succeeded in doing that. And the three probably most important individuals in bringing it about was Buddy Collette and Bill Douglas, the drummer.
Mm-hmm.
He was and Marl Young, the pianist and arranger. They were probably in the varying stages the three key figures, but many other musicians like Benny Carter played a big role. And, of course, an important number of white musicians in Local 47, where it was a real struggle to get support for this amalgamation. But they did. It took them 4 years, and they did bring it about.
I imagine there was just a lot of work to be gotten if they could get that kind of acceptance with the unions.
It did benefit some. People like my old teacher, Bill Green, and Buddy Collette got into the studio scene and were busy, et cetera. But what seemed to have been the case was they would let a few people in, and that was it. And the old studio cliques maintained themselves. And a lot of the musicians have had, over the years, second thoughts about the amalgamation. Some of them were opposed to it. Some of them said we gave up too much. We had a community institution with Local 767 right on Central Avenue. It was a community gathering place,
right?
Place for young people and old to meet, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't just business. It was also social and cultural, and they lost all that. And a few people were able to really expand their careers, but most weren't able to. In fact, it was a few years after the amalgamation, I think it was Marl Young who told me, when he got involved in the union and became an officer of Local 47, he started hearing from some black musicians who said, man, we're not getting any calls about anything. When cold calls come into the office, we never get tagged to go out on these calls. So Marl started investigating in the union records. And he started going through these files that list all the musicians in the local. And he started noticing funny marks, either before or after the names of black musicians. There might be an asterisk, or there might be a check mark.
Right.
And then he realized that they had a way of indicating who the black musicians were very, very on the low down, and then not calling them whenever a cold call came in. So, even after amalgamation, they were fighting.
It never ends.
But, it's just on and on. Same old.
And what you described a little bit earlier about when they amalgamated, there was this community dimension was lost. And as you mentioned that, all I could think about was when baseball got integrated, at least at the major leagues, it spelled the end of the Negro Leagues, which also offered an opportunity for black entrepreneurship and a certain kind of connection to their own community that was also lost. So if this is progress, it comes at a cost.
It really does. I think, the challenge that was never sorted out was, obviously the amalgamation resulted in greater political strength for the union and for union members, which was a good thing. But it didn't address issues of social economic equality, cultural equality, et cetera. And that was the challenge. It's good to establish basis for political equality and eliminate boundaries, but then what about these other things? In other words, there are real limitations if your fight just involves getting formal political equality, but it's not enough. You have to keep fighting. And it's always been a struggle for recognition anyway. As you mentioned earlier, finding out about this history and doing it justice and honoring it, and especially, it's almost too late now for Central Avenue because just about everybody's gone. Mm-hmm. But it is such a battle. I mean, there have been some good things like the cleaning up of Central Avenue, some landmarks being put up, the Central Avenue Jazz Festival, which happens the last weekend of every July, COVID allowing.
Right.
And But, even the city, it wasn't long ago that I noticed down on Central Avenue a plaque. They put up a series of plaques honoring places that were important venues for the music in Central Avenue's history. And if you go down the avenue, you'll see these plaques in front of the Dunbar Hotel and the Lincoln Theater and places like this. And so I was down there one day, and I'm standing. One of the great places for music then was the Elks Hall on Central Avenue. Everybody played there. Count Basie to Gerald Wilson's band, you name it, Dexter Gordon, et cetera. And a legendary place on the avenue. And the place where it was, the building no longer exists, is 4016 South Central Avenue. It is now a school and a mosque. And back in the 20s, early 30s, the address was not 4016, but 3616. In 37, it was changed. Anyway, that's the location. It's where MLK dead ends into Central Avenue. Well, if you go down there, there's no plaque honoring the Elks. But if you go a few blocks north, down to the Newton Police Station, there is a plaque there saying, Home of the Elks Club, 3416 South Central Avenue. Completely wrong. Of all the places to put the plaque, they put it in front of a police station.
That's go ahead. Yeah. And that station was a fortress. I mean, it might as well have been the head of the Gestapo if you were living there at that time, and
oh, yes.
Those cops were brutal in Newton Division. One of the great seemingly pivotal moments in the history, not so much for Central Avenue geographically, was the arrival of Charlie Parker in Los Angeles, actually in Hollywood at a place called Billy Bird's, which also doesn't exist. But I can say this much, it is the location of a Peruvian restaurant called Los Balcones. And to me, his arrival in Los Angeles with that band in 47 was transformative in terms of the music and how it affected all the players at that time. What's your understanding of that moment?
Just a couple of qualifiers. Bird came out here with Dizzy Gillespie's band.
Mm-hmm.
And it was December 1945.
Okay.
That they came out to play at the invitation of Billy Berg to play at his club in Hollywood. So, and it's funny because you read a lot of jazz history, and what it says is they came out here bringing bebop for the first time to Southern California, and nobody turned out, nobody was there, nobody liked it, and they went home after a couple of weeks. Although Bird stayed, of course, but for various reasons. That's another story. But that's, another way in which the story is wrong, because people had heard bebop earlier. Coleman Hawkins had a band playing in L.A. months earlier that had a lot of boppers in his band who were playing bop. So they had experienced the sounds that way. They'd also heard some of the recordings that had been made in 1945. Plus, bebop was being played on Central Avenue by Howard McGee and Teddy Edwards and their band at clubs like the Downbeat in the summer of 1945. So months before Bird and Dizzy came out here to play, people were hearing this new music on Central Avenue. And there was even a young band, the youngsters, high schoolers, who were playing bebop on the Avenue. And that band, the leading figures in that band, my goodness, it was Teddy. Teddy Edwards was with him. It was Big J McNeely, who was playing bebop then. It was Sonny Chris on alto sax. It was Hampton Hawes on piano. These are all great musicians. They would have great careers, but they were in high school then, and they had a stone cold bebop band also playing in mid 1945. So this music is being played in the community. It isn't to say everybody's flooding the clubs to hear this, but it's being played, and this is what the younger, more challenging artists are getting into and digging into. So when Bird and Diz come out here, Billy Berg's is filled for the first few nights with a lot of these local LA musicians, including some musicians who had been in the service and were up north in San Francisco, people like Buddy Collette and Jackie Kelso, who wanted to hear this music and had come down to see Bird and Diz. So it isn't quite, the case that they came out here with this new music that nobody had ever heard and nobody liked, and they went back home. It's richer, more complicated than that.
So the records had preceded them, and the recordings, and there was maybe the national radio broadcast. I'm trying to think what would have.
Bird had already made some recordings, and Dizzy, and people were familiar with these. And again, there were a couple of bands like Howard McGee, when he came out here, was playing out here. He actually left Coleman Hawkins' band and decided to stay here. And he put together this group, I think it was a quintet, and had Teddy Edwards playing tenor sax in it. Now, Howard McGee had been back east. He played bebop. That was his thing. And Teddy Edwards had been traveling around. And so these guys were familiar with that, and they were playing, this great band was playing bebop every night down on Central Avenue. So, the music was already starting to percolate out here.
But it got its powerful affirmation when they saw Charlie Parker. I mean, I can only imagine what that must have been like to be in that room when he walks on stage, It's just like...
Electric, absolutely electric, no question about it. And that's what many of them have said. And many have even said that the recordings don't do justice to hearing Bird live, because when he came into that room, his sound was so big, they were just blown over. And then he stays here, and Bird makes some of his greatest recordings.
And which is what I wanted to dovetail immediately into, this interesting character named Ross Russell, who gave us Dial Records and was a good writer. The novel that he wrote, The Sound, I really enjoyed, was very helpful. And then he wrote this biography, Bird Lives.
Yeah, no question. I mean, he's a guy who opens his Tempo music store. I think it was on Hollywood Boulevard.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Hollywood? I can't remember now. And he just decides he gets hip to new music. He starts stocking it, and he decides to record it. So he gets Bird and some of the other local guys like Howard McGee and others, and he gets Dizzy too to record also for Dial. And he records a number of records here, and he follows them back to New York in 1947, and he keeps recording back there for a little while. So Dial puts out, a tremendous amount of, this new music that's emerging now. He did a wonderful service by doing that.
Talk about Dolphins Dolphins of Hollywood, which was on Central Avenue.
If you wanted the latest black music, you went to John Dolphins. To Dolphins of Hollywood. And he not only sold the music, but he also had put a DJ in his window to play the music. So, and then he'd record. He started a couple of record labels, and he would record the music, and then he'd have his DJs play it, and then he'd have his store stocked with it.
What was that guy's name? Oh, I can't remember it right now. The DJ, he was very popular.
Huggy Boy.
Huggy Boy, that's right. Huggy Boy, yeah. How exciting and fun that must have been then. I can only imagine,
The other flip side, there are two very negative things when you talk about Dolphins of Hollywood. One is the fact that of the musicians I interviewed, there isn't one of them who had much good to say about John Dolphin. Most of them felt they were just completely ripped off. They never got anything for their contributions, for their recordings, and very unhappy. And the other negative thing certainly is when William Parker becomes chief of police in 1950 in L.A.
Right.
Well, one of his first goals is to break up the integrated atmosphere of Central Avenue, because a lot of whites would go down to Central at night to participate in the club scene. Many would go down to Dolphins to get the latest music. It was one of the few places they could go to get latest black music. Well, part of his campaign of harassment, at one point there was a police cordon, and it was specifically designed to turn white patrons away, telling them this is a dangerous area, you shouldn't be here. Get out of here. Don't go into the store. So it's, really a lot of it is a sordid history.
And Dolphin himself was murdered or killed for lack of royalty payment. I forget the exact story, but I remember reading that sometime later.
A disgruntled artist.
Yeah. Well, having been a stand-up comedian for a long time, I know a little bit about being ripped off by club owners and venue operators, black and white. Okay, and it's like it goes with the territory, I can tell you. Now we're kind of in the late 40s and early 50s, and one of the things that strikes me is the economics of music are changing, and it's just harder to support, these big organizations, these big bands. And so you see the rise of the small combos and the jam sessions and the after hours and this late night kind of hipster scene.
Certainly by the end of the war, there is a big change. There is a change in, I think, public psychology. There's a change in aesthetics. There's a change in, in taste. And the big bands, and also there are economic challenges that the big band structure can't meet. The big dance halls, et cetera, that provided employment for swing bands is gone. It's over with. People aren't doing that anymore. So, the big bands start folding one after another. But in their place then, if swing jazz is winding down. Although some big bands are able to continue, as we know. Of course, Duke Ellington keeps rolling along till, he passes, and then after, Count Basie has a year or two off around 1950, but then his band gets going again. There are exceptions, Lionel Hampton,
right,
Benny Goodman, etc., but most are collapsing. What emerges in their place, the music moves in two directions. One toward bebop, which is, for the most part, obviously not exclusively, but for the most part is small group jazz, although certainly big bands like Dizzy Gillespie's and others arrange bebop charts for large bands. But in general, the groups are smaller, performing in smaller spaces and clubs where there isn't as much dancing. The other direction the music goes, and that is music that is more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
It's more certainly theoretically developed and evolved, et cetera. But the music also moves in another direction. That's toward rhythm and blues.
Right.
Rhythm and blues emerges. And it emerges in Los Angeles at the end of 1945. And within a year, there are half dozen important small independent labels emerging to record and produce this music, this new music that's coming out that people do dance to. And basically the R&B lineup is a couple of saxophones, maybe a trumpet, and a strong rhythm section. It's basically a stripped-down big band that's gone back to playing blues and boogies and filtered through, the beats of the swing era. And it's that music with a lot of vocalists, and it's that music which increasingly captures, majority of the black popular audience. And that begins in L.A. R&B emerges in L.A. in 45, 46. And, of course, within a year or two after that, it goes national. I don't know how many times I've heard over the last few years, younger people, et cetera, say, yeah, rhythm and blues, didn't that begin in the 60s or the 70s?
No.
No. It goes back a long way.
And it sort of sets the stage for the tsunami that's coming for all these musicians, especially the guys that are on that little bebop island. It sets the stage for this tsunami called rock and roll, which I felt, as I look back on even my own childhood, I listened to rock and roll, 93 KHJ. I mean, it was just the beat of my youth. And it was only later that I could kind of double back and go, wait, you mean this was going on too? And actually just before? This is so rich and so interesting and a little bit hidden from my view as a suburban, white, publicly educated, upper middle class, white privileged kid. I had to kind of find this on my own. And then when I did, it was like, whoa, this is where I want to be. And I don't know if that was your experience, or certainly mine.
Yeah, similar experience. I mean, the first stuff I listened to, I can remember, was my folks' big band records, Glenn Miller and the Dorsey Brothers, people like this. But then the stuff that I really gravitated to on my own initially was early rhythm and blues and early rock and roll.
And the debt that we owe to black culture is just incalculable when you look back, whether it's music or, so many things. But the debt is overwhelming. We just sit on those invisible shoulders, at this very moment.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I'll tell you a story from my Central Avenue research and interviews. One of the R&B groups that I really loved as a kid were the Coasters,
mm-hmm.
who were initially called the Robins, and they came out of L.A. And the thing I loved about all those Coasters records was this incredible tenor saxophone that always had a prominent voice in their recordings. And I just loved the sound of that. And when they were in L.A., they had one particular saxophonist. When the Coasters went back to the East Coast, King Curtis became their tenor saxophonist. But anyway, I was doing Central Avenue interviews, and I had one set up with a saxophonist and vocalist named Gil Bernal, who played with Lionel Hampton's band for a while, etc. Gil had a good career. And as I was researching Gil's background, preparatory to us getting together, I discovered that he was the tenor saxophonist on those early Coasters Robins recordings in L.A. Young Blood and Searchin'. I just flipped. And so when I met him, I told him, man, you shaped me as a little kid.
Yeah.
I was thrilled to meet him.
I want you to talk about where Horace Tapscott kind of fits into this narrative, incredibly important. And I feel like he's a bridge that, if we're looking back, kind of can take us to pretty close to our present moment. And I know you did a ton of work on that. You also wrote I believe you wrote a book about the Dark Tree Jazz and the Community Arts in L.A. That's all about the Horace Tapscott experience. I'd like you to just expand on that, if you could, because most people still, if you don't go south of the Santa Monica Freeway and get on Crenshaw Boulevard and kind of live in that scene and integrate yourself a little bit, this stuff is still like most people don't have a clue. So I want to just sort of spread the word a little bit north of the freeway, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. That's not so unusual, and it's actually pervasive, and it's something that I had to find out about as well much later on. But I'll tell you a story that illustrates that. After The Dark Tree came out, I got an email from a guy who's a good friend now. He's a wonderful multi-instrumentalist, saxophonist, etc., named Dave Scher. And one of the things Horace talks about in his autobiography, which I worked with him on as well, and which I talked about in The Dark Tree, was a recording session that he did in the late 60s with Sonny Chris. And it was an album, Birth of the New Cool, they did for Prestige. And it's all Horace's music, and with Sonny, having the solo role, and Horace writing the music, arranging it, conducting it. And in the band, one of the alto saxophonists was Dave Scher. And I got this email after the book came out from Dave, who I'd met, I think, once before. And he said, what is Horace talking about, about what went on at this session? And because he had a different remembrance of it. And he also said, and Horace, he was just a local pianist who played in some clubs in South LA. He wasn't anything other than that. And I wrote back to David. I said, David, you really should take a look at this book first and familiarize yourself with some of this history, and then we can talk about it. Well, it was about a month later that Dave wrote back, and he said, oh, my God, I've been playing music professionally in L.A. and elsewhere in the United States since the late 50s. I grew up here. He said, I knew nothing about that whole world. I knew nothing about Horace and what he was doing in his community and the kinds of things he had done. And he was just blown away. He said it was like discovering another world. And he couldn't believe, how could he live here and not know anything about this? So it's the kind of thing that I know has been experienced by so many people. It's dramatically the case here. Central Avenue was a mystery to a lot. I think Horace and his Pan-African People's Orchestra over 40 years, from 1961 to his passing in 99, although the band continues to this day. Kamasi Washington was part of it a number of years ago.
Some awareness of Central Avenue is that people like Dexter Gordon and Art Farmer, achieved, and Charles Mingus, and as people trace their lives back, they could find out about Central Avenue on the strength of course, their talent, but also their celebrity. I don't know if Horace Tapscott rose to that level in terms of white people's awareness, and
right.
So he's a little bit below the popular radar. It's no reflection on his ability or talent. And I can say, because as many people know who listen to me, I play the clarinet, and a big part of my jazz happiness is the experience I've had over the last 6 or 7, maybe more years, every Thursday night, up until this virus, at the World Stage in Leimert Park. And I feel like it all sort of, there's just this continuum that still exists, albeit a slender thread of a continuum, I'm sort of
Yeah, I mean, it is, but, if you taste a little bit, like you've been able to dangle your feet, at the top of a very deep well.
Exactly.
When you're at the World Stage. This goes back to the early 20th century in Central Avenue, and I've come to the conclusion that one of the defining characteristics of the African-American community in LA and its cultural history is this notion of community arts, and has been very strong. And it's gone through Central Avenue. It went through the upheavals of the 60s and the Watts Renaissance, and it's carried on to the present day in Leimert Park. It's a continuous thread. One of the many interesting things about Horace Tapscott and his contribution is that he runs through all of that. As a young man, he came of age and honed his craft on Central Avenue. He was part of that generation that got the last best years of Central, and was embarking on a professional career in the 50s, but decides in 1961, as the community is changing, he literally walks off the bus after 2 years with Lionel Hampton's band because he was just frustrated by the commerciality in the music. And he walks home and decides to commit himself to building a community arts movement in South Central. And from 61 till he passes in 99, this is what he does. And he doesn't look outside the community. He builds everything within, does everything to support his community. And he is, in a sense, one of the forerunners, one of the continuators of the community arts ethos from Central. And then one of the forerunners of the Watts Renaissance and the whole Leimert Park scene, because that's what he's carrying, he and his comrades. A number of other people who joined him at the end of 61 to start this movement, like the great trombonist Lester Robertson, the bass player David Bryant, and a few others. And they build, this movement that over some almost 40 years involves almost 300 artists. And they have a tremendous impact throughout South Central LA. And it's a great story. And it goes into Leimert Park. When Kamau Daoud starts World Stage, I think it's in June 89, when he gets it.
With Billy Higgins, right? The drummer?
Well, yeah. Billy Higgins told Kamau a little while earlier that if he ever came across an interesting place, that he'd get involved with it. So Kamau gets the World Stage, a little storefront on Degnan,
right,
in Leimert Park, from the Brockman Gallery, one of their spaces. And initially he was thinking it was just going to be an artist place where people could do some rehearsing and playing. Billy Higgins was having trouble playing his drums all the time at home because his neighbors were complaining. Can you imagine being next door to Billy Higgins and complaining about it?
Yes, because I know what it is to be hounded by neighbors when you have to practice and they call the cops. Yeah. One time I was playing my clarinet, as I had to. It wasn't like a choice for me. I just was like, and all of a sudden there's a rap on my door, and I had some kind of intolerant neighbors. And it's the police. Could we talk to you for a second? I go, yeah. And he goes, well, we're going to complain about music. And I go, well, do you get a lot of complaints for Cole Porter? I'm just curious. It's usually some guy with an electric guitar trying to figure out Led Zeppelin. But no, it was Bill.
I had an apartment manager near the La Brea Tar Pits kicked me out of their basement. So I had to go out and practice my horns in Pan Pacific Park all the time. Yeah. But anyways,
go ahead.
Billy tells Kamau this. So Kamau takes his space from Brockman Gallery, and he has 3 keys made. One for him. He gives the other one to Billy, and the other one to Horace Tapscott.
Oh, my God.
And that's how the World Stage begins. But it was just going to be a place for, like minds to gather and do their thing. But it blew up into something much, much more. And it carries on this tradition, and it runs through the whole history of the community, and it's now the center in Leimert Park. And again, especially many of the OGs have told me, it doesn't have anything like the force of what it was like on Central Avenue, but you get a whiff of it, you get a taste of it there.
There's a sniff, and I'm happy to get it.
Yeah,
and it's I remember playing in the old space across the street, or the original space, and the guys would just. So many nice and interesting, wonderful people. We'd just be hanging out outside, and then they'd go, oh, that's a tune. I can play that tune. I'd wander in, and I'd stand against the wall, and then, okay, you do your solo. And I remember I just went for a number of times. I was too afraid. I just like, what am I doing down here? I'm. And then finally said, I play a clarinet. And they go, bring your goddamn axe and get down here. So, okay. And I had the clarinet in the case, but I wasn't going to take it out. That was scared me. Like, I don't want to take it out, because then I took it out, and then I just waited. Some tune I could just, even if it was just blues and F, I'm just going to get up there. And I did it. And I just kept going back and back and back until it was just so much fun. I had my challenges there, and a lot of the music, I'm not so familiar. I got to go learn that, if I wanted to call it next week. Oh, Green Dolphin. Okay. All right. Yeah. I like dolphins. Okay. I'm going to learn that tune. I got to get better. And it just really helped me leap. I always say in jazz, there's woodshed time and there's bandstand time, and you kind of need both, to get the woodshed stuff onto the bandstand, is a leap. And that place for me, and believe me, I don't have any musical career of any import, but the World Stage was just, I don't know, in many ways it just saved me. I just feel a debt to that institution.
Throughout all of this, the World Stage has survived. I got together with Kamau once, and we went through his archive, and I was collecting all the leaflets and the calendars he'd put together over the years as the director of the World Stage, and compiled a listing of, everyone who performed on Friday or Saturday nights at the stage from like 1990 up through about 2004. And it's just an incredible listing of musicians and artists. Just stunning.
It is, yeah. If you want more about Central Avenue, check out Central Avenue Sounds, authored and curated by Steve Isoardi, who's with me right now. And then The Dark Tree Jazz and the Community Arts in L.A. That's about Horace Tapscott and what he gave birth to. Am I right?
The spine of the book is a history of the Pan-African People's Orchestra, his main vehicle.
Right.
But it also, it follows all the branches into the community arts of everything that Horace and the orchestra touched. So it also deals with many other community, arts movements and institutions, because they seem to have their fingers in everything. So it does go into those as well. But yeah, the focus is Horace and the orchestra. Actually, I should mention a couple of things about the books. The first is Central Avenue Sounds is still in print. It's in paperback.
Yes.
At the University of California Press. The Dark Tree, unfortunately, is no longer in print. At the University of California Press. And we didn't get a paperback edition out, unfortunately. So unfortunately, it's become a collector's item.
That's why when I looked for it today, it was so expensive.
Yeah, that's pretty much the reason, and I really regret that. I don't know. At this point, I haven't begun the campaign yet, but I do want to look for a publisher to put out a paperback, a slightly revised paperback edition. But maybe people are really interested. If they can afford one, they can go to, look at abbooks.com or bookfinder.com, and you can pick one up. Yeah. Or go to a library and maybe read, their copy. But hopefully it's going to be available again in some form. And there's a new book I've got out now called The Music Finds a Way. It's a brief 100-page thing about how some of the members of Horace's movement, what it was like for them growing up in South Central LA from the late 40s to the mid 60s, and how in a difficult situation they found their way to music and ultimately becoming community artists. Anyway, but in terms of recordings, let me recommend a couple of things. I'd say a live recording of Horace and his quartet at Catalina's in Hollywood from 1989 is generally considered like one of the top 50 jazz recordings. It's called The Dark Tree, Volume 1 and Volume 2. It came out on the Swiss label, Hadart. And it's come out in a number of reissues since then, but that is just extraordinary music. For the orchestra, a couple of things. There were Nimbus West put out 3 different recordings in the late 70s, early 80s of the orchestra, and they're all fabulous. One is called Flight 17. Another album is called The Call, C-A-L-L. And finally, there's a 2-album set. I think it's a 2 CD set now, called Live at the IUCC.
It's a community center or something, a church, I think.
It's the Emmanuel United Church of Christ, where for about 9 years, they played the last Sunday of every month there.
Wow.
And were recorded over the course of about 9 months. Now, there are 2 new releases. There is a record label in France that I've been working with called Dark Tree Records. And over the last 2 years, we've put out, I think, 2 wonderful Horace Tapscott and the Orchestra CDs. The first one is called Why Don't You Listen on Dark Tree Records. And that was Horace's last time leading the orchestra at full strength, recorded live at Blackmount in 1998. And the second one, which came out just a few months ago, is called Horace Tapscott and the Orchestra, Ancestral Echoes. And those are studio recordings that were done in 1976. So those I would recommend for people who really want to get up close and personal with Horace.
Well, thanks again for joining me. I just appreciate the chat. I really do. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure, Bill. Love talking with you.
So there you have it, folks. A cool deep dive into really a forgotten and so important history, all about Central Avenue and the cultural heritage that we live with to this day. Until next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean, namashaloha.